Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Ratio Christi event this week. We really hope that we will all have a good time. Thank you for tuning in. Just a couple of announcements. First of all, next week events will be, we have a speaker from the US his name is Don Deal, and he has done a lot of research on the cult of Scientology. So next week will be a lecture on the cult of Scientology. And well, maybe I should have started with just to tell you guys who Ratio Christi is. So maybe just a couple of thoughts on who we are as a ministry. Well, Ratio Christi is a campus student ministry where we equip Christian students to give historical, philosophical, scientific reasons why they are following Jesus Christ. And we usually do this, we usually accomplish this mission of ours by meeting once a week. We have chapters at different places in South Africa, at Stellenbosch University. We have a chapter at Pretoria University, also in Potchefstroom, in Pietermaritzburg at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and then also at Rhodes University in Grahamstown. And so we have weekly meetings, but ever since the lockdown, we have been moving all our ministry efforts online. And this is why we have this weekly event, which is on our YouTube channel. So if you feel like you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, also remember to do that. And then as a campus student ministry, we are dependent on donations. So if this ministry has helped you in the past and you feel like you can help us out as a students ministry, we would also really appreciate that. So I would really like to encourage anyone who feel like they can or want to help us out financially. We would appreciate that very much. In the description of this video, you can also find a link to our website as well as the donate page. That's all the announcements for this evening. Now, I want to introduce our speaker this evening. His name is John Nerness. He holds an undergraduate degree in sociology and philosophy and an MA in philosophy, and he is currently busy completing his PhD in missiology, focusing on theological dialectics at Northwest University of Potchefstroom. Now, I've recently got to know John, and I've had a couple of conversations with him the last couple of months, and it's been real fun. So, John, thank you very much for taking this time. Thank you for joining us. It's good to see you. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm glad to be here. So, the topic at hand is a conversation about theological explanations. And so I want to put this in the context of apologetics, because that's obviously one of the major concerns of Ratio Christi is giving a defense of the faith. So along with giving arguments and reasons for the truth of Christianity, sometimes in the conversation, and this kind of broadly spans out to not just apologetics, but also kind of missions in general. One of the helpful things might be to give an explanation about something in reality, some phenomena or phenomenon in reality, and how a Christian understands that. And especially in the area of kind of was titled by J.H. Bavinck as missiological or theological dialectics, that also is giving a theological explanation for non-belief. Why are there non-believers? And so just to start off, kind of an example would be if somebody says, well, if Christianity is true, why are there so many different religions then? Well, a theological explanation for that would be, given the fact that we're created in God's image and we're what J.R. Tolkien called sub-creators, we're very creative. We make things, we build things, we discover things. And so given that fact, and also the fallenness of human beings, because of sin, we become very creative in creating idolatrous systems and structures and ideologies. So that would be a type of theological explanation for this phenomena. And it purposely is not giving an argument per se. It's just giving an explanation how a Christian might explain that, and to use the term within their worldview. So also theological explanations should include what would be called natural theology. And natural theology, as Christians would work that out, I come from the Reformed tradition, so it would be natural theology of the regenerate. And so that would be the metaphysical truths that we can discover from the created order and from that reason to the existence of God. And one of those kind of primal metaphysical truths would be, philosophical truths would be the distinction between essence and existence. Essence, what something is; existence, that something is. And within the tradition of the Reformed scholastics that go back to Thomas Aquinas, that would be considered a real distinction, not just a distinction of the mind, but a distinction that actually is the case in reality. And I refer to you to something like Edward Feser's 5 Proofs, or Gavin Kerr's whole book that he wrote on this. He's a philosopher out of Ireland, if I remember right. So, but I'll give you kind of a quick rundown of that. We can know what a pterodactyl is. We can know what a hobbit is. We can know what an elf is. We can know what an elephant is, and a horse. But if you didn't know those things in the real world, let's suppose you were locked up in a room somewhere and somebody taught you a definition for each of those creatures, you wouldn't know whether they actually exist or not. So there's knowing the essence alone doesn't mean that it exists. So essence being what something is, and existence being that something is. Okay. So from that kind of philosophical distinction, one can argue to an argument for God's existence. And that's not really my purpose tonight. But you can use those categories. That would be part of the categories of natural theology. And then, of course, what we might call special revelation or revealed theology, as God has revealed himself in the scriptures, and then ultimately in the person and work of Jesus Christ, which the scriptures attest to. So even in that, the type of explanations we give, we have those kind of broad resources of general revelation in the natural theology that can be built off general revelation, and also special revelation. And both of those can be used to give an explanation, because a lot of times even training people is just training them on how would we explain this? How would we understand this? And that even includes interpreting the scriptures in a theological way. The whole kind of area of redemptive history or biblical theology assumes that, yes, there are many different human authors, but then behind of all that, there's ultimately one author, God. So the Bible's a theanthropic book. It's a God-man book. And so we have the resources of giving a theological explanation for the scriptures as well. And like I said, none of that's to forego making arguments for particular issues of history, making arguments for the resurrection, or making arguments for God's existence. So I see this as kind of twofold. One is you can use theological explanations to help people better understand the faith. And then you can also use theological explanations for if somebody brings up to you, well, you know, how does Christianity explain this? For instance, like I just gave, for the example of why are there so many different religions? Okay, now you might find that to be a good explanation or not. It's just to give you an idea. The other thing that what part of what I've trying to combine is that if you look within the Reformed tradition, there's been this understanding that in the interpretation of Romans chapter 1:18 to the end of verse 32, that all men know God. And the question is, well, then how do they know God? Is it by means of reasoning? And that just doesn't seem to necessarily fit, because not all people are, number one, understand arguments for God's existence, or number two, have ever even thought one through. So part of explaining even ideological systems, and I'm going to do the best I can here in the next few minutes, and if I miserably fail, Daniel, I will call upon you to try to help clarify. So, but I think you can take that distinction I just talked about, the essence and existence distinction, and say that at some level, all human beings have what Herman Bavinck, accommodating off Friedrich Schleiermacher, and I refer you to Corey Brock's work on a recent book released on Herman Bavinck, but it's slipping my mind the exact title of it. But if you look up Corey Brock, you'll find it. It was part of his dissertation work. But this feeling of dependency, what does this feeling of dependency mean? It means that at some level, human beings know that they don't uphold their own existence. And at some level, all human beings know they don't define their own essence, that they have these creaturely limitations. And so that primal kind of type of knowledge that every human being has, when one is trying to move away or run away from the existence of God, at some level that has to be suppressed. The knowledge of upholding your own existence has to be, or the knowledge that you do not uphold your own existence, as well as you don't predefine your own essence, has to be suppressed. And if I'd have been thinking, I would have pulled this up. There's actually a very interesting quote by Karl Marx, where he says that if I hold the position that I hold my that my existence depends upon another, then that means I don't uphold my own existence. So he even understood it at those primal levels. So he was willing to say that he upholds his own existence, which seems rather a very kind of ridiculous thing to say. Bavinck talks about relative dependence as well as ultimate dependence. Relative dependence is I need food, I need water, I need companionship. And ultimate dependence would be the very fact that I exist has to be accounted for by a being such that it must exist, a necessary existence such as God, where his very essence is to exist. And so those kind of natural theology, that's going to explain this primal knowledge. And then here's what I want to propose too. That primal knowledge comes via a consciousness of this feeling of dependency, which is not as clear as the essence existence distinction, but it's experienced by all. Okay. And so the reason this can be argued for is we can move from this feeling of dependency to a philosophical distinction between essence and existence to ultimately an argument for God's existence. So we're not just making a subjective claim that can't be worked out in a philosophical way and in a way of an argument. But let's just suppose what I'm saying here actually is the case. Then part of suppressing the truth and unrighteousness would be that folks, I'm sorry, I've got something popping up here on my screen. But part of suppressing the truth and unrighteousness would be that that people have this feeling, and when they suppress that feeling, they make something else the primal level of consciousness. And also, if you look at Romans 1 and 2, you not only have this feeling of dependency, you also have this knowledge of God's law through natural law. So we know the law of God through revelation, like the Ten Commandments. We also know the law of God, or the work of the law, by nature. We can reason by understanding the nature of reality to that. And so this I call the Romans 1, Romans 2 dialectic, is that if this primal knowledge of this feeling of dependency gets suppressed, and this primal knowledge of the law of God gets suppressed, something else has to take the place of the consciousness in that suppression. And a new type of law has to be made in that suppression as well. I think both of those take place. I use Marx as an example. For Marx, what should be the primal level of consciousness is class consciousness. That's the consciousness that we should awaken people to. And then out of that grows some sort of new type of morality and moral laws, which one would be to free the oppressed from their chains of oppression. And so both of those we would view as a type of suppressing what's even more primal, that existence is a gift, and what's more primal, that we have a knowledge of God's law written within our hearts. And then let me add one more thing, and then I want to open it up for some questions here. The other thing I'd like to add is, if the natural law is written in men's hearts, and that's the case, then inevitably we're the type of creatures that we attempt to justify ourselves by doing good works. And so one thing that would separate the Christian religion, that if the question's asked, is a Christian saved by good works? The answer is yes and no. No, not my own good works, but yes, the good works of Christ on my behalf. Well, then one of the things that would come out of that knowledge of the law is that we would constantly trying to do good works, trying to merit something. I think, even something as almost obvious and mundane today as virtue signaling is explained by the fact that people want to be justified. They want to be right based on some standard. It's just that at the end of the day, the standard ends up getting changed away from the law of God to something else. Okay. And I'll open it up for you to kind of fill in some spots there, Daniel. And there's a lot more I could say to that, but that just at least introduces people to the type of theological explanations we would give. And ultimately, I think the goal has to be give a theological explanation for the nature of unbelief itself.
Okay, cool. Thanks, John. So just a reminder for the listeners out there, you can also post some of your, if you have questions, please post it on the live feed in the YouTube. We will address that as well as we go along. Now, John, thanks for unpacking some of the examples and also some of the dialectics that you referred to there. Now, let me just quickly show the people this book that you've sort of put me on with this. This is the book "Their Rock is Not Like Our Rock" from Daniel Strange, which John has referred me to. Also, if you would like to read up more on this idea of giving theological explanations. And one of the things in this book, particularly, John, maybe you can unpack that, is Hendrik, I don't know how exactly you pronounce his surname. I think it's Kramer. I would pronounce it as Kramer. But Hendrik Kramer introduced the idea of subversive fulfillment. And he just mentioned it sort of in passing in one of his works. But Daniel Strange in this book particularly, he sort of expands that and applies it to the gospel. Maybe you can also share some of the content that he has unpacked with regards to the idea of subversive fulfillment and the gospel.
Yeah. So let me go. This is not so much, if I remember right, Daniel Strange does this, but I want to kind of build something first and then move to your question. So I think the best way to understand evil is a privation of the good, a privatio boni. So that means that there's no such thing as like absolute evil. It has to parasite off of and rely upon the good. Okay. Well, in a certain sense, you can say that with truth and falsity as well. So there's, no matter how much corruption's within an ideological system, there has to be some level of truth within that system. And what comes through in what truth is affirmed within that system is kind of a longing for or a moving towards and a longing for what is really true. Okay. And on a personal level, it's to know the person incarnate himself that is the very truth. And so subversive fulfillment, if I understand this right, would be the idea of kind of what Paul does in Acts 17. He appeals to these metaphysical truths found within the poets and philosophers of that society. And he says, you know, this unknown God that you don't know, I'm going to now proclaim to him. Now, so that means within their systems, there's some falsity and there's also truth. It has to be. And so Paul appeals to what metaphysical claims they affirm that are true. And then from that, he moves towards talking about the God of the scriptures. And so this means in any engagement that one has with someone, it's like apologetics can go one of two ways. You can kind of focus on the corruption within the system and reduce it to absurdity, or you can focus on what's true in the system and show that ultimately is fulfilled in Christianity. Does that help?
Yeah. All right. Now you've mentioned the feeling of dependency, where Herman Bavinck sort of accommodated Schleiermacher with that that sense of this feeling of dependency. Now, recently, I know that I think his name is Andrew Payne, also wrote a chapter in that new book from the Davenant Institute, where he also introduces another phrase, which apparently comes from Jacques Maritain. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right as well, but he sort of equates it with Calvin's sense of divinity, which is, according to Calvin, a natural instinct. But I think the phrase that he used is the contingency of intuitive being.
Yes.
And I think maybe you can also show how, you know, the sense of divinity in Calvin, and then this phrase, this contingency of intuitive being, and then the feeling of dependency. Does those three link up somehow?
I think so. Yes. Let me and certainly when I'm talking, I'm kind of playing off what you're saying. So I'm not trying to exactly get what those people are saying, but I would say a few things to that. So whatever knowledge we have of God comes through and is mediated through the created order. Okay. In fact, one of the heresies is what's called ontologism, that somehow we could have a direct intuition of the essence of God. Romans 1 makes clear that that's not the case. What we do know is God reflected and revealed in the created order. Okay, so I think Calvin holds to that. I alluded to Aquinas does as well. I think what the Reformers did, although you do see certain Roman Catholic authors lean this way at times, but what the Reformers really did was kind of focus more on the subjective knowledge and experience of God in the created order. Whereas I think this is where Aquinas is so helpful. He works that out based on this essence existence distinction. And if you hold to a doctrine of simplicity, you hold that as well You even see Cornelius Van Til in the Defense of the Faith book when he's engaging Gilson, the Roman Catholic scholar. He even talks about that distinction. He uses the word, it's the same distinction, being and essence. So to affirm the traditional Orthodox doctrine of simplicity means that we know God is simple by means of knowing the created order, that there's a distinction between essence and existence. Okay. And so what I'm saying is there's also this primal feeling, and to try to be faithful to Bavinck on this as well, and I even hinted, I think you could say Van Til as well on this, is that we also feel this contingency, as you just said. What was it? How did he say that again? What was the exact?
Yeah, he phrased it as contingency of intuitive being.
Yes, and you do find that in some Roman Catholic writers, and I think that's referred to even in the work that's been done on John Calvin in relationship to Payne's work. It's very helpful, and so I would encourage reading him as well. I think that's the same thing. That sensus divinitatis can be worked out, and it's right down the line of Bavinck's feeling of dependency. And then the philosophical objective way to defend that is to make an argument for the real distinction of essence and existence. Yes.
All right.
And I would say, Daniel, every human being at some level knows this. And by the word feeling here, Bavinck certainly doesn't just mean kind of this more thinned out understanding of feeling. He means a knowledge at some level. But I think, like Calvin, he would say this feeling of dependency, or sensus divinitatis, it's not as clear as the philosophical distinction once we work it out and reflect upon it and think about it. But every human being has it at some level.
Yeah. This is just out of my own curiosity. I know that Romans 1 and Romans 2 is specifically appealing to general revelation, right?
Yes.
And natural theology that comes from that. Now, Norman Geisler also links this up with cults and says that, well, it's not just general revelation that's sort of suppressed or twisted. You get it with special revelation as well. So I was just wondering, would you make that jump by when we talk about many of these? Well, you've just referred to the suppression of truth. We can call it the anatomy of unbelief, if you will. But I guess that sort of, if you look at cults as well, that sort of plays out in how they deal with not just general revelation, but special revelation as well.
Yeah. So, and this is kind of the freedom of working within missiology. And you also have to take into consideration that there are spiritual powers and forces, right? So even these false ideologies, which I know is not popular to say, certainly at a secular academy, but it's clearly taught in the scriptures. And I think it also explains the evilness of evil at times too. So some of these false ideologies, how much of that is coming from, spiritual demonic forces, how much is coming from just the fallenness of the human mind? It's hard to tell. But certainly we know that in the area of special revelation. Now, if you take an example like, I used an example earlier of like Karl Marx or Marxism, it comes with this very kind of heavy weighted moral type of judgments. But then one has to ask themselves the question, can that be defended philosophically? Like, can you give a reason to believe there's such a thing as an objective moral law? And I don't think given that kind of view of metaphysics, you can. Okay, but why is it that you can't defend that philosophically? But man, you want to use it, and you also want to use it in relationship to the human psyche. because one of the powerful things is certainly the use of guilt and guilt manipulation and shame. And I think you see that even in secular writers like Franz Kafka in The Trial. I know I was sent some interesting stuff on Kafka traps, and especially as it relates to critical theory. So yes, I think special revelation too, and this is a long-winded answer to your question, which is that one of the things that wants to be denied is the glory of Christ, that he truly is revealing his Father, that as Paul says, you see the glory of God in the face of Christ. At some level, that gets suppressed. That revelatory glory of him being fully God, fully man, and one person, at some level, that gets suppressed. And I think that's absolutely right. And there are many ways that is done. And we could think of secular ways that is done, as well as what we would title as cults.
Yeah. I know Herman Bavinck says at some point that both general and special revelation finds its ultimate fulfillment in Christ. So
yes.
So in that sense, what you just referred to, that there's also this suppression of the revelation of Jesus Christ as he is revealing the Father.
Yeah, and to play off Bavinck, so the Logos weaved throughout the order of the created world gets suppressed, and the Logos taking on a human nature gets suppressed, which the Logos is the very basis of truth found in the created order, and the Logos is the revelation of God's truth found in the face of a man.
All right. Now, let me quickly just go back to the anatomy of unbelief. I like that title. I got it from...
I do too. Can I steal it?
Yeah, sure. Well, I stole it from Os Guinness first.
Oh, okay. Well, all right.
So we can both steal it from him then. But he sort of names four things on the grounds of what you've basically just unpacked with the suppression of truth. He says it's a unbelief abuses truth through a deliberate act of suppression. That's the first one. Unbelief abuses truth through a deliberate act of exploitation. Third one, unbelief goes further still and abuses truth through a deliberate act of inversion. And then the last one, unbelief abuses truth through a deliberate act of deception that ends in its own self-deception. That's just you can get it for the listeners out there. This is from Os Guinness's book called Fool's Talk, in his chapter on it, which is titled The Anatomy of Unbelief.
Yes.
But I just thought to throw that out there as well.
Well, let me on the issue of self-deception, is actually, and I like I read regularly any of these guys, but it was actually the presuppositionalist Greg Bahnsen that did his dissertation on self-deception, and one way to define that that he defined it is deception of the self by the self for the sake of the self. And I think that's right. I think at some level, if you go along with Calvin, it's like, do we know the self first? Do we have this knowledge of God? Well, it's both, because we have a knowledge of our own contingency. And so at some level, there has to be deception that goes on, right? So the non-believer is going to say that Christ is not who you think Christ is, right? The Son of God incarnate, died, buried, rose from dead, ascended to heaven, coming again. And part of what we're trying to do is to say, but you're not really who you think you are. You're not just a physical, we can't just reduce you down to biology, chemistry, and physics. In fact, those are potentials that actualize in a person. So what's primal is the person. Not you should atomize and reduce the person down. You're a substance, you're a unity. And so part of it is you say Christ is not who he is, where we're trying to convince you you're not who you think you are. And so that's where I think Guinness is right, certainly down those lines. And that's part of now. In what way that deception happens, I think some of it's mysterious because evil itself is mysterious. Unbelief being a form of evil. Think of evil as mysterious because it's too dark to understand. God is mysterious because he's too much light, right? Well, evil itself, in the nature of the case, has an inexplicability to it. So unbelief would have that as well. It's kind of a dark mystery rather than the mystery of God's light, which is a whole nother topic, because the way we understand mystery and the way some of our non-believing friends might understand, well, the way they understand mystery are going to be probably very different.
All right. Now, there's a chapter in Daniel Strange's book on the Tower of Babel and how that sort of plays out in this context of the theology of religions. I don't know if you maybe want to comment on that.
Yeah, so I'll give you my thoughts off it, and I don't. Once again, I encourage you to read Daniel Strange's book, but one of the things, part of a theological explanation, is one of the things that we're constantly trying to do is to imitate God, at the same time deny him. Okay. Let's go back to essence and existence. So we learn that in the created order, and I think Genesis 1 clearly teaches creation ex nihilo. I know there are scholars out there that try to deny that, but aside from that, let's just go with the orthodox line here. It says that, the Spirit was hovering over the formlessness or void, in the Hebrew, tohu wabohu. So each day God is taking this and he's making distinctions in reality, and he's forming reality, and he gives us this by the days of creation. So God is, as it were, taking the formlessness and void, because he has complete power over it. God speaks to the waters and they're still. Okay. And by the way, Jesus does the same, which is a pretty good sign. Jesus is God, that he can still the waters. But that's aside from that. So one of the things that in our fallenness we want to do is we want to treat reality. In fact, Bavinck brings this out. We want to treat reality as if it were already in a primal state, as if God has not predefined the essences and made these distinctions in reality. So we come along and we say, no, by us speaking, by our linguistic conventions, we will control reality. Okay, so and so then we can form and name reality to be whatever we want it to be. God has not predefined reality. It's not the purpose of a human being to discover reality as God has created it. Rather, the purpose is for us to treat it as if it's formlessness and void and recreate it. Okay. And kind of down the lines of what's going on. One way you do that is you just cause all sorts of upheaval and a revolution and societal revolution. And then you can create reality in whatever image and whatever ideology you want. I think that's what's going on at the Tower of Babel. And the idea is to make a name for themselves. Well, why would their name be what's primary? Well, God's name means that God is the only one that can bring something from nothing, and God is the only one that can define the essence of something. So now, if you think you have those powers, which only, I won't have time to get into this, but only a simple infinite being does have those powers to bring something from nothing. But if you approach reality as if you have those powers to do it, it's an perverted, inverted type of mimesis, imitation of God's act of creation. And that's And that means we can name what good and evil is because we can name what reality is. And that's one of the reasons that people have not liked natural theology as well as especially natural law. Because if things have a nature or have an essence, that means that certain moral actions are unnatural and they go against natural law. So if we can just scrap the whole world of having a nature, then nothing I morally do is unnatural then. Okay. And so that's to kind of try to imitate this primal formlessness and void, or tovu wabohu understanding of Genesis. So we're constantly trying to imitate God and go back to that primal creation. If that made any sense, I don't know.
Well, the Hebrew part made no sense, but the rest made sense.
I don't pretend to understand Hebrew either. Just
maybe you can just repeat that again because it sounds funny.
Tovu wabohu.
All right. Let's move on here. Thanks, John. I think that was very helpful. So you've already alluded to, I'm going to ask just one or two more questions, and then I'm going to open it up for some Q&A from the live feed. You've mentioned some of the dialectics, and you've already referred to the essence-existence dialectic a couple of times. So I think we can leave that one for now. But I was wondering, you've also in the past, I remember you mentioned the rational, irrational dialectic, and then also the consciousness and conscience dialectic. Maybe you can just unpack those two separately, and then
sure. By the way, this kind of whole project of giving theological explanations, we know that the non-believer does that to the Christian as well too, right? So the reason you believe there's a God is because you've projected him, kind of Feuerbach's approach, or it's the opiate of the people, Marxian approach, or it goes back to some suppression of the subconscious, the Freudian type approach. The non-believers constantly explaining religion or explaining away religion or theological claims all the time. We're just, as it were, returning the favor. But there's one key difference, though. If I'm telling my non-believing friend, if God does exist, and he does give you the gift of existence, and he does predefine your essence, then your consciousness should be aware and focused on him alone because of those primal realities. Okay. You owe your the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. Listen, your consciousness should be focused on him. And then your conscience should be shaped by his moral law, because he's already predefined what you are. And that means that the good is predefined ahead of time. Now, God doesn't arbitrarily predefine it, because the good in the created order, and this is a whole different issue, the doctrine of analogy, reflects him. It's not arbitrary. It's based in his perfect, intelligible nature. So it's not some sort of voluntarism that God could say, today murder's wrong and tomorrow murder right. It deals with the Euthyphro problem as well. So I say that to say that that's certainly the case. Okay, let me try, and this may be a horribly miserable attempt. This kind of dialectic, Van Til talks about a rational, irrational dialectic. There's another German philosopher, theologian, Eric Bijara, and I may be completely butchering his name, but he talks about the essence existence dialectic, where in this kind of non-believing dialectic that doesn't hold what Christians hold, we believe that reason is fulfilled by faith. So faith is a way to know reality, and reason is fulfilled in that. That's for a whole nother conversation. But for them, everything is just within this immanent realm. There is no God. It's just the world. That's it. So in kind of thin forms of scientism, they're going to focus more on the objective reality and the essence of things. But their view of essence is going to be an imitation of a real view of essence, which is a predefined nature by God. So the essence may be based on physical characteristics or other kind of reduced characteristics, okay, which are real. We don't deny that. But we're just saying that's not to understand the fullness of reality. It's reductionistic. While other people, like standpoint epistemology, right? It's popular with critical theory now. They're going to focus on standpoint.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you. Maybe you can just define standpoint epistemology for the listeners out there.
Yeah, so that's going to be focused on the one focuses on objective essence, but I mean a very thinned out view of essence. The other focuses on a thinned out view of what a person, or excuse me, what a person or individual existence is. And so in standpoint epistemology, what becomes the primal basis of reality is the experience of the individual. Now, there's a little shell game that gets played with this. It really, in a certain way, standpoint epistemology depersonalizes the person because it almost disregards the actual experience of a person. The thing I do like about standpoint epistemology, back to subversive fulfillment, is it focuses on persons and takes seriously listening to experiences. But in one sense, I think it disregards those experiences because normally it's the intellectuals speaking on the behalf of the individuals than people actually listening to the persons that have those experiences. Okay. So that would be the standard. And I refer you back to your other guest, Neil Shenvi. He deals with that. But standpoint epistemology would be moving more towards the existence or existential side. Forms of scientism would have a thinned out view of what an essence is. Standpoint epistemology has a thinned out view of what existence is. But from whatever gets projected about the experience of the marginalized or oppressed group ends up looking like an essence. So the dialectic is you move from the subjective irrational to some sort of projection of an essence. If you take a thinned out view of what an essence is, that ends up being reduced down to just subjectivity sometimes. Okay. Like an obvious example of racial essentialism, where you just took physical characteristics and you tried to take an accidental quality and define that as essential to somebody. Well, the reason that ends up being absurd is because it doesn't accord with reality. And as I always say, it doesn't accord with what even a child on a playground knows. That's another human being with the same essence I have. I don't know if that was helpful at all or not, but that's kind of to introduce some of the thoughts on that. For Van Til, it moves from the irrational to the rational, and from the rational to the irrational. From Bajara, it moves from a focus on essay or existence or the existential experience to essence, and from essence back to existence. Now, here's the important thing to remember. If Jean-Paul Sartre talks about essence and existence, he has a depleted understanding of both of those. He's only using those terms to imitate what's real, but there's also falsity in his definition of those terms.
Okay, John. That was very helpful. Thanks. All right, I'm gonna ask one last question, and then I'm gonna. You can just, if you want to comment on this very briefly, you can. Otherwise, I know this is part of your PhD thesis, but just the idea of theological nihilism. Maybe you can just explain that briefly and make some comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
So, a very helpful book on this, and I freely admit I don't have original ideas. I just have to take it from other people. But Connor Cunningham, I think he's at University of Nottingham now, within the Radical Orthodox movement. and I find some very helpful material from the radical Orthodox as well. He wrote a book, A Genealogy of Nihilism. And so if you think of philosophical nihilism as saying what ultimate primal metaphysical reality is reduced to nothing, right? There is no meaning. There is no, if it's epistemological nihilism, there's really ultimately nothing to know. If it's existential nihilism, there's no meaning to life or reality. So what's primal is nothingness. Okay. So theological nihilism is to really kind of do a theological analysis of nihilism, and understand that kind of the great exchange, and you find this in Romans 1, is so you take the fullness of God's reality, you reduce its categories down, and that's a type of privation. So if human beings are nothing but matter in motion, and then theological nihilism wants to explain, which I've been attempting to do, why someone would do that. Why would somebody reduce a human being away from that? Well, it's back to this truth suppression move. So you're trading the fullness of something, reducing it towards nothing. It's not literally nothing. We couldn't talk about it. But it's in a weird sort of way, it's analogous to nothing. So when you reduce a human being from being persons creating God's image that have an intellect and a will, and there's freedom in some sense, then you reduce it down to just matter and motion. You've taken something, reduced it towards nothing, and now you're calling the nothing the fully something. That's a type of nihilistic move. And then that nihilistic move, how does that get explained theologically? And that's kind of what the goal of theological nihilism is, to explain why would you make such a move. It's like exchanging the truth for a lie and now calling the lie the truth. Exchanging something for nothing and then calling the nothing something. Because creation is, because of the analogy of being, creation, because it's an effect and God's a cause, in some way reflects God. There's a greater dissimilarity than similarity in that. But this is a weird sort of move, because now it's this privation of reality, this reduction of reality is it doesn't even make sense to say this, but it becomes an analogy of nothing, which is, it's just irrational in that sense.
All right, thanks, John. We've got a couple of questions here. The first one is, with the theological and philosophical categories that you utilize, what would be the explanation for original sin and the fall of man?
Well, and rightfully so, I would put it under a privation of the good. So if it becomes very bizarre when you talk about evil or sin. It's the opposite of, in one sense. I don't mean the exact opposite, but if creation is bringing something from nothing, it's like a privation is taking something and bringing it to nothing. Okay, so if we understand sin under our privation of good, the privatio boni, then sin in the nature of the case is just irrational. It's like an event without a cause. It's very bizarre. And by that, I don't mean you don't have a human being with a will and an intellect and all the rest. Of course, that, but it's like a decreation. It's going against, it's violence in the sense of it's going against the very nature of what a human being is. And a human being was created to love and serve God and love and serve their neighbor. And so sin and rebellion to God is an experiment against reality itself. And that's why it's very difficult to explain it. And I think part of the explanation is I can give you a reason why you can't explain sin, because now we're back to this dark mystery idea. Because in the nature of the case, it is a dark mystery. It's irrational in that sense. So if it's like blindness or privation of the good, in a weird sort of way, the unfortunate thing is that sin is the one thing we can do that God can't. Okay. And I'm by unfortunate, I mean, we do it. I'm glad that God can't sin. So I don't mean it that way. Okay. I didn't mean it that way. I just mean that we do it and we can do it, in that sense. And it's all part of God's plan and purpose. And he's bringing his glory out of it because of his son. And his son came and participated, as it were, in that nothingness, as well, to save us from that nothingness. So if you think of the original creation as God calling something from nothing in a primal metaphysical sense, the act of redemption is God calling something from the nothingness of sin. A recreation.
All right. Next question. How would you approach an atheist and engage them in conversation about theological explanations? So what does it look like practically?
I think I wouldn't force it. Look, I think in any encounter with someone, you just, it just depends. I think we should develop them and use them when the time's there. It's kind of like it just depends on who you're dealing with and what kind of questions they have. I also find theological explanations helpful for Christians, because a lot of times, like, for instance, the question of why there are so many different religions. Sometimes people go off to college and, the professor will say, well, if you were born in India, you'd probably be Hindu. If you're born in Saudi Arabia, you'd probably be a Muslim. The fact that you're born in the United States. So they give this kind of causal explanation. Now, from that, what they think is proved is not proved. But that really messes kids up sometimes. So if we already have a theological explanation for why there are so many religions and they're already equipped with that, that may be one of the things that helps them. But as far as when to use those in an encounter, it just depends. Depends on what questions somebody's asking. And you can make it clear. Like, I'm not making an argument here. I'm just telling you this is how we would explain it.
Yeah. All right. Next question. Is there an effective way to make people aware of this sense of dependency?
I mean, this is going to sound... because a theological explanation includes the work of the Holy Spirit, pray for them to feel that. Prayer is so important in our encounter engagement with our non-believing friends that we love and care about. Ultimately, that's a work of the Holy Spirit. Now, we should appeal to their intellect, give them reasons, and we should appeal out of loving them, showing them a good will. Both of those should be there. But ultimately, many times, I think if you talk to people's experience about when which was being pushed down at some level, it's very difficult to explain, when that just came out at moments. Maybe it was the death of somebody they loved. Maybe it was they found about, they just hit them in all of a sudden of their own mortality. I think there are moments that happens, but that's part of God's providence, plan, and purpose. Ours is to be faithful in giving good reasons and to do so out of a good will. But yeah, ultimately, the Holy Spirit will bring those realities to them. That level of revelation. I think of King David, right? So Nathan comes to King David. Well, if you gave David a quiz and you're like, hey, David, is adultery wrong? He'd be like, yeah, that's a sin. It's wrong to do. And then Nathan tells him a story about him, right? And I can only say it in the King James where it sounds so good. But Nathan finally says to David, thou art the man. So that whole patina and veil that was over his eyes all of a sudden disappear. That's a work of God, and praise God that he does that.
Yeah. It makes me think of Osgini as well. Again, he gets it from a sociologist called Peter Berger, but Peter Berger wrote about what he called signals of transcendence. And so maybe this will link up with the feeling of dependency from Bavinck, but he says basically that these signals of transcendence is moments in people's lives where they experience something that just, they might be an atheist, for example, and then there's an experience which sort of just, even if it's just for a moment, they realize that maybe this world isn't all there is. Maybe there's a transcendent reality out there, which is real. And so, yeah,
it could be the first time you hold your newborn child that this reality resonates and comes through. It could be knowing your own mortality. It could be moments of suffering. As C.S. Lewis says, suffering can be God's megaphone to us. So now you look for meaning. Well, guess what? Christianity finds its locus of meaning in the one that hung on a cross in a shameful, naked way before all the world to save us. So then we see that suffering has a transcendent and ultimate meaning in the person of Jesus Christ. I forget who I heard this from, but one reason they said they came to the faith was because is a Roman Catholic guy, if I remember right. But he said one reason he said he saw two paintings, one of Christ and the other kind of, maybe it was I'm adding to this, but maybe it's like a postmodern type of painting. And the question was, which painting would you like to see before you die?
Yeah. Yeah. But the idea is that like you mentioned, like that we should love people enough. And sometimes we are there when those signals of transcendence to comes through, and we should sort of trigger them and point people towards the signals and where it's coming from. But in any case, that's also another discussion.
Let's do one more question, and then I've got to get going here.
Sure. Thanks, John. Here's one. How would theological explanations address the tenets of critical theory? Now, that's sort of a heavy question, but you can maybe just take
I hinted at it earlier. So in critical theory, they want, it's kind of Romans 1, Romans 2, dialectic. They want to make something primal to the consciousness, okay? Whether it's class consciousness, or race consciousness, or issues of sexism. And once again, there's truth to this. It's just that it's not it shouldn't be the primal consciousness. Something is deeper. To use Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, there's a deeper magic. And then they also want to form and shape your conscience by new types of rules and laws that imitate the law of God. Okay. We think of terms we didn't know, maybe, or I say terms that weren't used at least 100 years ago. It might be less than that. Like xenophobia, transphobia, all these things. These types of terms are used to shape and form a conscience. So to begin to imbibe this ideology is to have your awareness based on this, to be consumed by this one issue and topic, and then also that shapes the conscience. And then however the conscience is shaped also reforms what you're conscious and aware of all the time. So that's one way I would approach that.
Okay. Well, thanks, John. Hopefully we can schedule another event with you one of these days. But thank you very much for your time. For the viewers out there, thank you again for tuning in, and thank you for your questions. Remember that next week we're going to be same time on the cult of Scientology. And that's all from my side further. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.